Welcome to the Stephen Mansfield Podcast.
Very recently, I did a podcast about guns, and I got a huge amount of feedback from many of you. Some of you were correcting me, some of you were agreeing with me, some of you were asking for more information. I was very grateful for the feedback, and so I want to talk a bit more about guns. This is not an area of my specialty, as you'll discover in just a second, but I think it's an important topic. I think it's important we talk about it, and I think that some of you are resonating with my sort of moderate stance on guns, and maybe that's a little bit different from what you're hearing from people on different extremes or different sides of the issue in our culture today. So let's talk some more about it. But I want to start with an apology. I did something in that podcast that I have done once before, and I know better than to do it. It is completely my fault and a result of my absent-mindedness when I'm talking about things I'm passionate about, and that is that I called the AR-15 rifle, which I was talking about because it was used by the shooter in the Parkland school shooting in Florida. I called the AR-15 an automatic weapon. I know better. Believe me, I know better. Not only have I been corrected before, I've actually held an AR-15. I know it is not an automatic weapon. I know that AR does not stand for assault rifle or automatic rifle. It's the initials of the manufacturer. I know that 15 is not a number related to anything automatic, that it is instead the number of times the manufacturer worked on this rifle to get it right. I'm very aware of this. I have good friends who advise me on such things. I walk with a lot of military buddies here in D.C. And oh boy, did they let me know that I had screwed up. So 3 times in that podcast, I referred to the AR-15 as an automatic weapon. I'm sad that I did that because I don't want to be adding confusion to our public debate about guns in this generation, and also because I just want to be accurate. I want to be right. I don't want to get it wrong. You need to know that we don't pull podcasts unless I say something that is absolutely going to cause damage to people. I will occasionally make mistakes. Usually I will correct them. We either will correct it in the text that accompanies the podcast online, or I will correct it in a future podcast like I'm doing now. So rarely are we ever going to pull a podcast unless I inadvertently say something that's going to get people hurt. Mislabeling the AR-15 is not going to get people hurt. It might, for a week here, mess up some people's understanding of the debate, but now I'm clarifying. So the AR-15 is not an automatic weapon. You have to pull the trigger each time it fires a round. You can't hold the trigger down so it just releases rounds automatically. That is not what it is. It is possible to put a very large magazine in it, up to 50 rounds, I'm told, and then you can just pull the trigger rapidly 50 times, and it does damage because of its velocity and because of the speed with which the rounds are firing and how many there are. But that's not the same thing as an automatic weapon. So I do sincerely apologize. The last thing I want to do in the Stephen Mansfield podcast is cause any kind of ignorance to increase. Now let's talk about some of the questions that you have asked about guns, some of the things you want to debate, some of the things you want to discuss, and keep the comments coming. I'm happy to dive in. A great many people wrote in about the constitutional issues around the Second Amendment. They're hearing about the Second Amendment. They don't know much about the Second Amendment. And so let me just give a brief overview. I'm not going to be exhaustive about this. Whole volumes are written on this. There are people who are lawyers and legal scholars and have whole careers devoted to this. But the Second Amendment says, a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Now, you need to know that this was written at a time when it was essentially understood in English law that the right for citizens to bear arms was essential to their defense. It was essential to their protection, both from criminals and in some cases from errant civil magistrates. And so this was very much the thinking. But now it's the very wording of the Second Amendment that causes so much trouble in our modern debate, because it begins with a well-regulated militia. So, those who are on what we might call the left side of this debate, those who are not pro gun ownership by individuals as others are, say the only thing the founding fathers intended to do here was to allow arms to be kept by those who were in militias. In other words, there was a civil government function here that is described, not necessarily ownership for sport and individual defense by individuals. And for example, Justice Ginsburg on the U.S. Supreme Court now would make the case that the whole of the text here of the Second Amendment has to be judged by the issue of a well-regulated militia. That's the opening clause. That's the meaning that hovers over all the meaning of everything else there. Others, obviously, the NRA, others who are in favor of gun rights, of the right to keep and bear arms of individuals for sport, for hunting, for defense, focus on those two words, keep and bear arms. The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. So as often happens in legal debates, it's almost where you put the emphasis. Do you put the emphasis on a well-regulated militia, or do you put the emphasis on the right of the people to keep and bear arms? Our founding fathers clearly believed that an armed citizenry was a safer citizenry, and they also believed that this was a right individuals had. In the Federalist number 46, I'm reading, this is of course the 46th of the Federalist Papers, which was a defense of the Constitution. James Madison said he was critical, for example, of European nations, or European kingdoms, he called them, which contemptuously were afraid to trust the people with arms. You see how he was thinking, that trusting the people with arms is an important right. He also assured his fellow citizens that they need never fear their government because of the advantage of being armed. So that's how the founding fathers thought. I think James Madison captured it very, very well. What's interesting is that we had Supreme Court rulings earlier in American history that seemed to lean towards the well-regulated militia argument, seemed to see the entire of gun rights as belonging to governments, not to individuals. But that all changed. Any questions about that changed in 2008 when the U.S. Supreme Court issued its ruling in District of Columbia v. Heller, and absolutely held that the amendment protects, that the Second Amendment protects an individual right to possess and carry firearms. So if you are in question at all, yes, the U.S. Supreme Court recently, by the way, that's only, 10 years, a decade ago, that ruling came down. Recently, the Supreme Court said in District of Columbia v. Heller that the Second Amendment does guarantee individuals, not just the state, not just militias, not just the Army Reserve, for example, does guarantee the state, individuals, the right to possess arms. And then in a very interesting case, Caetano v. Massachusetts in 2016 took it a little bit further and said that the Second Amendment also protects the owning of weapons that were not in existence at the time of the founding. This case had to do with a woman carrying a stun gun, I believe in Boston, by the way. And so the question was, is it legal for her to carry a stun gun? And the Supreme Court said yes, that this Second Amendment does protect the owning of weapons that were not of a kind that were not in existence at the time that the Second Amendment was drafted. So the Supreme Court has been pretty broad in recent decades in its application of the Second Amendment. It does not simply see the Second Amendment as being about the authority of civil government or just regulated militias organized by the government, but instead that the individuals have the right to keep and bear arms, and that they can keep and bear arms of a kind that could not have even, of course, been conceived by the founding fathers. So that's a brief overview. Of course, that all comes into some debate and into some contention when we have shootings, when we have the kind of shooting we had in Florida. The problem in Florida, a lot of it has to do with the age of the young man. First of all, he was mentally unstable. Second of all, there had been about 30 formal complaints about his behavior. But then he waited until he was beyond the age of 18 so he could buy his AR-15. And that was in a state where he couldn't have walked in a bar to buy a beer. So this is part of the debate, part of the discussion that's going on, is that we have a young man who, again, couldn't walk into a bar to buy a beer, but he could buy a semi-automatic, notice I said semi-automatic weapon, and did such horrible damage. Now, some people wrote in and asked me, what about restrictions? Well, I'm, again, not an expert in this. I'm not a lobbyist when it comes to guns at all, trust me. But I have made the point in previous podcasts that it seems to me that in a reasonable society, certain cautions, certain provisions are perfectly reasonable when it comes to the purchasing of guns. For example, I have no problem with what some people have called a cooling off period. If under certain conditions, if I come in to a gun store, if I'm angry, if I seem to be in a rush, I don't know what the provisions would be. In some cases, I certainly can see a cooling off period. In some states, they've even proposed that a guy ought to buy a gun and then wait a week for it. Why does he need it? Anybody who needs a gun overnight probably isn't up to any good. I got to tell you, in theory, until somebody talks me out of it, I'm good with that. I'm good with it being the call of the gun store owner, and I'm good with it being a standard cooling off period. So what if I have to, go into a gun store, choose the gun I want, and come back and get it 3 days later? It just doesn't seem to be that big a deal when it might save lives. People sometimes are killed by guns that were purchased just hours before. It doesn't happen often, but apparently it does happen. I have no problem with a background check. If I want to buy a gun, I go into a store, I choose my weapon, I make my payment, I give them my basic information, and there's some database, there's some background check. I'm checked for criminal activity. I'm checked for mental illness. I don't see a problem with that. Why not a background check? I've shared a number of times in these podcasts that I have a concealed carry permit. I had to have an extensive background check to carry a weapon. I don't have any problem with that being applied to some degree to the purchase of weapons as a whole. And by the way, particularly to weapons that are way beyond the scope of simple defense, sport, and hunting. I have a little bit of I don't see any reason that there shouldn't be a background check for somebody who buys an AR-15. I don't have any problem with that. And I'll tell you another thing that I don't have any problem with. And again, I'm happy to be talked out of this. And I know right off the bat that some of my more armaments-oriented friends are going to be upset with me for saying this. And again, I'll probably have dinner tonight with some people who won't like what I'm saying here in some cases. But my point is that I don't have any problem with the issue of registering weapons, in part so that the government can know when somebody is amassing weapons. I don't know the exact stats as I sit here right now, but the number of weapons that the Las Vegas shooter had should have alerted authorities that something was up. I mean, for a kid in Florida to have one AR-15, I realize that's not going to raise any flags. But the shooter in Las Vegas had dozens and dozens of guns. I believe I've been told 46 guns. Now, if a guy's got 46 weapons and he's not running a store and he doesn't run a game ranch or something, then somebody should at least drop by for a visit. Seems to me there's at least a point at that there. If somebody owns 15 AR-15s, if that's even allowed, it seems like it's perfectly legitimate for someone to say, "What's up? What you doing? What are these for? You don't own a gun range. Why do you have these stacked up in your bedroom closet?" Doesn't seem like that's a problem to me. Now, having said all that, I want to maybe seem to you like I'm switching sides on this debate, and that is that I believe in gun skills being taught the young. I like the lore of weaponry being taught to the young. I took my kids and we shot pistols together. I taught them how to use them. My daughter, my son, I taught them how to use a weapon. My son borrows my weapons from time to time. He lives in Washington, D.C., so he's not keeping any himself. I believe in teaching those skills. I want my daughter to be comfortable with guns. I want them to know how they work. I want them, if they choose to be able to own them for sport, for hunting, for defense. It's perfectly fine with me. I like the heritage of it. I like them knowing about it. I teach as a historian, not as an expert on weaponry, but just the difference between a musket and a rifle and the difference that made in our wars. And I think this is all part of our history. It's a skill I want them to have. I want them to have a respect for weapons. I want them to have a respect, by the way, for hunters and what that's meant in our history and what even just the acquisition of food requires in some cases. And yes, I want them to have them for defense. I don't want them to be crazy about it, walk around in fear, but I want them to have them for defense. So I'm a big advocate of that, and I'm not trying to convince anyone listening to this podcast that they should run out and buy a gun. But I think this is something that is allowed to us as citizens, something we ought to have, and increasingly in our world, I don't mind saying that I think for good people who are skilled and experienced to have and carry arms just makes society better. As I've said before, I'm no great shakes. I'm a pretty good shot. I'm often carrying a pistol, and people around me are safer because I am. I don't see myself as the savior or protector of the world, but if I'm sitting with a couple of my friends at a basketball game and I happen to know that they have concealed carry too, let me assure you that game's safer because we're there and we're not even thinking about it. But just because good people who shoot a lot, know what they're doing, have got weapons, if some shooter decides to, start shooting up the audience at a basketball game, at least there's some answer, and the police have some help. I realize there's debates about this, but I'm just telling you what seems reasonable to me. I think that there's something we've got to think about. This is another thing somebody asked about, and that is that in our present world, with the level of violence that's happening, with the guns that are out there in the wrong hands, in the hands of unstable people, we've got to begin to look at every large gathering that happens in our society and ask ourselves, are the people safe? We've seen schools shot up, churches shot up. I don't think there have been any major sporting events. We've seen elementary, little nursery schools shot up. We've seen shootings at malls. We've got as a society to begin to consider the safety of every large gathering that happens in our society. Every church needs to consider, not again putting, AR-15s in every window or making all the deacons train or anything like that. But what would you do if somebody walked in? In that horrible shooting in Texas, it was one guy with a gun who drove off the shooter and I believe actually shot him and then put him in a position where the police then could capture the man or finish him off, so to speak. But the man was at least run away from the church because a person who didn't even attend that church came at him with a weapon. It's a debate we're going to have. It's grisly. It's not easy. Anyone who advocates gun ownership and gun skills as a safety measure in our society ends up sounding like a gun nut, and I'm not. But I just strongly urge that those of you who are pastors, those of you who head schools, those of you who bring together large gatherings of any kind, I'm not wanting you to walk in fear. I'm not wanting you to be nervous. I'm not wanting you to arm up in some ridiculous way. But we've got to begin to consider that we're living in a society where we have enemies, where we have mentally unstable people, where guns are often in the wrong hands and not in the right hands, and we need to look at every large gathering and consider the safety of that gathering. A couple of more small things. Somebody asked me what my favorite gun is. I have a Kember 1911, which is a .45 caliber, and I love it. I have large hands. I enjoy shooting that at the range. It's my favorite weapon. It's what I'm often carrying, and I love it very much. I think the important thing, this goes to a question a lot of people asked. The important thing is that we not just have to consider our constitutional rights, and we not just have to consider the current laws on the books, but we have to consider what's happening in our world. In the United States, mentally unstable, emotionally unstable, young white men are doing most of the damage when it comes to shootings, when it comes to violence. It's not ISIS. It's not, for the most part in our society as a whole, men of color. That I certainly can point to regions of the society where young African-American men with guns are doing horrible damage, south side of Chicago, for example, etc. But for the most part in our society, it's mentally troubled, emotionally troubled, young white men who are doing most of the damage. And most of them are what we would call self-radicalized. They have gotten angry. They have gotten upset. They have gotten supercharged. They have grown violent in a process that very few other people, if anyone, is involved in. That's why parents don't know about it. It's why teachers and coaches don't tend to know about it. So we have a society in which, in a sense, the barbarians who might become the invaders of our lives are arising from within the society, not so much coming from without. This is not, by the way, a commentary on immigration. I'm not talking about immigration right now. I'm talking about what we're growing in our society. And if you listen to my podcast at all, you know I care very much about the issue of men in our society, spend a lot of time speaking to men, urging men to be mentors. We need to pay attention to what's happening amongst young men in our society, especially young white men. Please don't think I'm excluding anybody else of any other color, but I'm just talking about the damage being done. We've got to pay attention to the troubled youth. We got to pay attention to the unfathered youth. We've got to, as they say in my largely African-American church here in D.C., get a hand on a man, touch them, be with them, be close to them, be near them, know what's going on, and try to make a difference. We've got a difficult society. Yes, gun ownership is a right and it's a privilege and it's something that probably does make us safer and something that I practice myself. But that's not the only issue. I could have 15 fantastic weapons in my home, and that doesn't solve the societal issue of mentally and emotionally disturbed young white men who go violent. So let's make sure we keep our eye on the ball here. Whatever the rights are, whatever kind of weapon the shooters have, whatever's going on legally, constitutionally, whatever protests are happening in D.C., it's all important. It's all part of a national debate. But I'm going to say it one more time so we don't forget it. Emotionally and intellectually disturbed, young white men who go violent are doing the most of the damage. Let's see if we can make a difference there as we assert our other rights as well.
Stephen Mansfield is a New York Times best-selling author, a popular speaker, and a frequent faith and culture commentator on Fox and CNN. His groundbreaking books on faith and society include The Faith of George W. Bush, The Search for God in Guinness, Mansfield's Book of Manly Men, and Lincoln's Battle with God. Learn more at stephenmansfield.tv.